Hi, and welcome to episode 5 of this interview series. I'm very glad that we are reaching at this point today. I'm very honored to present to you my conversation with my friend Bart Édes. Bart is a professor at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, where he lives today. He's an expert in international development, public policy, and policy making. But that's not all. He's also an expert in megatrend analysis, risk analysis, and foresight. Bart spent almost 20 years working at the ADB, the Asian Development Bank, being his last position as the representative in North America for this bank. He's also a writer. He published a book called Learning from Tomorrow in 2020. Bart is a graduate from the University of Georgetown, where he got a BA in government, and he also has a master in public policy by the University of Michigan. My conversation with Bart was a very entertaining and rich one. He talked about his long experience living and working in Asia and his particular vision of the future for this important region of the world. He also talked about the state of the art of futures and foresight studies in Canada. And he also had some time to make some remarks about his particular vision of the future for Latin America. You know that I always ask that to our guests. I am sure that you're enjoying this interview very much, and I hope to see you in the next one very soon. Good morning. Hi, and welcome to this interview with my friend Bart Édes. Bart, how are you? Good morning.
Mauricio, I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to having this discussion with you, and it's a bright, sunny day where I'm checking in from, and that's Montreal, in Quebec, in Eastern Canada. So yeah, it's all things are going pretty well, and there's light at the end of the tunnel, as they say, with vaccines making their way around the hemisphere.
That's right. And well, first I appreciate again your presence here. Thank you very much. And yeah, it seems like the light it's looked at the end of the tunnel. I hope so. I really hope so.
Yeah.
So Bart, uh, I would like to start with this interview. And how did you become familiar with futures and foresight? What's your original profession?
Sure. It's kind of a long and winding path, but recognizing we only have so much time, I'll try to keep the story short.
Okay.
So professionally, I've dabbled in different fields. I guess in the last 20 years, I've spent most of my time focused on international development with a regional focus of Asia. So I've been with the Asian Development Bank and just left that organization a few months ago. And before that, I had been working on public sector governance, so reform of public administration in Central and Eastern Europe. This was in the years immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union and the opening up of Central and Eastern European countries. And I was with a program that was run by the European Union and the OECD, supporting public administration reform in countries like Slovakia, Romania, Estonia, and neighboring jurisdictions, countries that for the most part wanted to prepare for membership in the EU. But moving forward to Asia, or again, where I've spent most of the last 2 decades living there, actually based in Southeast Asia for most of that time, I was working with the ADB mostly on the softer side of development. So ADB does a lot of financing of infrastructure like transport, energy, sanitation, water supply. My concentration was mostly in areas like civil society engagement, social development, social protection, gender equality, and again, public sector governance. I also had the opportunity to become involved in some innovation projects related to support of social enterprises and inclusive business. And I guess getting to your question about foresight and futures, so 4 years ago, I was managing ADB's knowledge management team, which is responsible for guiding this big international organization on how it uses its intellectual assets, how it taps into the knowledge of its staff, learning from the experience of past projects and research. And my team came to me and said, look, we're hearing a lot about futures thinking and believe that this is something that ADB should be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I embraced this idea. It made good sense to me, and in fact overdue, I thought. And we held a workshop bringing in a world-class expert on foresight and future studies, a one-off to expose a couple of dozen staff to some of the basic tools and methodology behind futures thinking. So that was my first real big exposure. But I would say, Mauricio, it's in the context of being in Asia. So spending so much time engaged with the region, one could see firsthand the tremendous transformation never seen before in probably history of humankind, in terms of the social transformation, the economic transformation, technological, just Asia's rise and influence on the world increasing over those 2 decades. So in a sense, being in Asia, I was seeing the future unfold, and then became myself exposed to futures thinking. And since that moment 4 years ago, when we introduced the ideas within ADB, I began to study more closely the field, start doing reading, doing outreach to experts in the field, and just becoming fully absorbed in this exciting domain that has so many different branches, but altogether involves trying to make some sense of the future, identifying opportunities, and becoming more aware of the risks ahead of us, depending on how different plausible futures unfold.
This is very interesting coming from somebody who lived for a long time in Asia. So you have realized of all the changes, and now that you say that they have changed a lot in a short period of time, and they are very future focused, I think. Are you agree with that?
Well, I definitely say so. And many of the cultures in Asia have a very long-term time frame, in contrast with what you often see in the West, especially in the business world, where there's a lot of concentration on next quarter's profits, and with the political cycle and the next election, it's hard to have a longer term look. And I think many parts of Asia have embraced, if not foresight initially, it's a natural progression to take up some of the tools. I might just mention in this context that Singapore, which frankly leads Asia in so many different ways, they have a very well-regarded team at the center of government advising on futures thinking and foresight. It's a globally recognized foresight team and the Center for Strategic Futures. Mm-hmm. And they are an example to other countries, central governments that are thinking of setting up or beefing up a team that they already have focused on futures.
Great. Yeah. I want you to talk about your experience at ADB a little bit later. But before that, you mentioned something about international development, and how do you see the use that it's increasing, I think, of futures and foresight in international development agencies like, well, the ADB and some others in the world? How do you see that?
Well, foresight was already beginning to take root in international organizations focused on development. And I think that the whole horrific experience that we've gone through with COVID and the economic and very human consequences has stirred further interest in futures and foresight, in large part because this surprised a lot of people, what we've gone through, even though there were plenty of warnings. I mean, experts in the health field, and in fact, foresight studies done years ago pointed to a plausible future of a major global pandemic that would be very disruptive. But this really shook, I think, shook up people in the development field. And actually, international development is really well suited to foresight. As you know, Mauricio, foresight can be used in many different places, many different topics, sectors, areas of specialty. But I think in the case of development, it's really well suited because of the inherent uncertainties of development. How do you go about lifting up a country? How do the people in a low-income country aspire to a more prosperous, stable, sustainable future? It's very complex. And so foresight is good for uncertainty and volatility and a mix of different drivers of change that could steer future events in this direction or that. And we think, for example, of the global framework for international development. In 2016, the world came behind the Sustainable Development Goals. They went into effect in January of that year with a time frame to 2030. And foresight looks typically 10, 15, 20 years in the future. And there you have the SDGs looking 10 plus years into the future. So there's a natural fit. Other things that foresight can help do is build resilience in organizations, and international development is also aimed at building up resilience and seeking opportunities. Maybe just one or two quick examples, Mauricio, about what I've seen is not only in my organization, a former organization, ADB, picking up foresight 4 years ago and running with it. You also have, in the Western Hemisphere, you have the Inter-American Development Bank, kind of the sister institution of ADB, but working in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. They have also embraced foresight using various scenarios in their country planning, their strategy documents. So as the IDB coordinates with different developing countries and plans assistance to the country for the next handful of years, they're bringing in scenario planning, one of the key features of foresight. You can also look at the IMF, which is using the scenarios as well. For example, looking at post-COVID scenarios, looking at the future of work in Africa, and using scenarios to help strengthen the surveillance work of the IMF. IMF is also using policy gaming, so simulation exercises, structured simulation exercises, more for the shorter term to try to look at how different policies might be implemented to address various challenges that developing countries may face. So this is the tip of the iceberg. You've got other organizations like the UNDP, which for many years has had a hand in foresight. They, for example, published a guide to using foresight to advance the Sustainable Development Goals, and through their whole network of innovation labs is working with countries to build their capacity on foresight.
Right, and UNESCO, for instance, they have done a terrific job with futures literacy, for instance, right?
Absolutely, and they are a leader, and they are also working in developing countries, well, countries at every level of development. But UNESCO is clearly a major international influence in thinking about the future, particularly around the concept of futures literacy and building that up.
Exactly. And now let's go to Canada. Okay, let's go to Canada, to your country. And what would you say about this, the state of the art right now of futures and foresight in Canada? I mean, I know it's been really important for the government. They have policy horizons, for instance, but also I would like to know your opinion about this in universities, in organizations. What could you say about the state of the art of futures and foresight in Canada right now, Bart?
Well, like in many other countries, Mauricio, I think foresight is experiencing a bit of a renaissance. It's many people are realizing that the time is now to begin including foresight in organizational planning, in policy making, and in strategy. And so that could also be said about Canada. I mean, you've seen an increase in interest and activity in the last half dozen years, but I would say in the last year and a half during COVID times, that has accelerated. You mentioned policy horizons. So this is the central government unit that has links to the Privy Council, to the Prime Minister's office, and it is a center of excellence, of expertise on training and methodology on foresight, which it shares globally. And so you have policy horizons working with different ministries and agencies, different parts of the Canadian government, like in immigration or forestry, the Bank of Canada, the Standards Council. Many different government entities have in the last few years set up foresight units. Now, they might be very small, but they've nonetheless established some permanent responsibility for futures thinking. And at the subnational level, you have cities, for example, in the province of Alberta or in Ontario that have used futures thinking. It spills over into the private sector, into academia. You ask about universities. One of the leading universities for foresight training is in Toronto, known as the Ontario College of Art and Design, and they offer a master's degree in design for foresight and innovation. And you have individual courses, so not a full degree, but you can take foresight courses through, for example, the Conference Board of Canada or Carleton University in Ottawa. So there is this ecosystem. You may be familiar with the whole concept of meetup groups. So before COVID, you'd have meetup groups. You could go online. You could join a community of interest on whatever topic it might be, and meet in person. This is pre-COVID, and hopefully again in the near future. And in COVID times, they've been meeting by Zoom. And so you have a meetup group on futures in Vancouver on Canada's West Coast, with nearly 1,500 members. Now, those are people in Vancouver and across Canada who are interested in futures. And given that we've been all connecting via video conference, people could join and participate in discussions outside of Vancouver. There's a similar meetup group in Toronto with almost 800 members doing the same thing. So there are these centers of activity and interest. You have a number of foresight consultancies, or firms that include as a part of their consulting services foresight work. You have a platform focused on urban futures that was recently Future Cities Canada, bringing together various actors to look at, for example, how inequality and climate change can be tackled successfully in Canadian cities in the future. I mean, I could go on and on, but you're getting a picture here, I think, that foresight is taking root. The one thing I'd leave you with, though, at the government level, at the central government level, notwithstanding the expertise that exists, particularly in policy horizons, there's sometimes still a bit of a disconnect from the excellent work that may be done with a big foresight study and how that is put into action, how it's implemented and taken up in policy. And I think globally, this is one of the great challenges, is that there's this great work and stimulating scenarios and a lot of effort going into these things, this analysis, but how is it actually influencing decisions being taken by government and influential actors in the corporate sector?
Yeah, this is a challenge, and we will talk about that later when we talk about your book as well. But what it's very interesting is the fact that it's not only at the national level then, but also at the province level in Canada that efforts in foresight and futures is being done. And I think that's a model that we should take a look at and learn from that, because I don't think it happens in a lot of countries, this kind of effort at the province level, right?
Yeah, and I don't want to overstate that. So it's not in every province. It's not necessarily systematically approached. It's more like you could call them islands of enlightenment that realize foresight can be useful. So there are examples to look to that other communities and provinces can learn from, and I think should be making this part of how they approach the post-COVID world, incorporate into regular strategic planning and budgeting and policy. This should be a regular part of their work, strategic foresight.
Of course. And now I would like you to tell us a little bit more about your time at ADB, because I am sure this was a very important part of your life. You working there for a long time. So how was your experience at ADB?
Well, I consider myself really fortunate to work with an organization like this with a vision of a prosperous, inclusive, sustainable region. Asia has been, again, pre-COVID, experiencing very high rates of growth. So there's a lot of positive to the story. You've seen poverty as a share of the whole population plummet. You've seen low-income countries move into the ranks of the lower middle-income countries. In fact, by say 2030, there may only be one or two remaining low-income countries in all of Asia. Wow. Whereas when ADB was established in 1966, there were dozens, right? So this is not because of ADB alone. ADB is just one of many actors trying to support the region. This is the ingenuity of the people and their work and the governments involved. But I believe it has played a role in marshaling resources, building capacity, bringing in good practice from outside of the region and increasingly from within the region. Much of my work at ADB was focused on, at the outset, on communications and engagement with civil society, which when I began work wasn't a real strong point of the institution. It was very government-centric, and didn't always do a great job of engaging with communities and consulting and getting alternative views and listening to criticism about project design and how things could be done better. And I do sincerely believe that over time, the institution has gotten a bit more thin-skinned. It can take some criticism. It will listen to alternative perspectives. It will allow critics inside the room. And I think that's really benefited the organization as it's enhanced its accountability mechanisms. It's become much more transparent. It works regularly with different civil society organizations at the grassroots level and international NGOs. And I think this enriches the organization quite a bit, because you need more public participation. You can't just have centralized decision making about development, because you don't really you won't meet the people's needs, and you're going to inspire opposition when it's not necessarily. When you can get communities engaged in shaping for example, the path of a particular road, or if people have to be resettled because of a major project that will benefit the country, make sure that their concerns are dealt with and that they're properly compensated. And ADB has beefed up its what they call their safeguards team to give attention to environmental and social impacts of projects. So while trying to help countries, there are sometimes unintended negative consequences. Any kind of infrastructure project will do that. With proper planning and participation, you can minimize those. So maximize the positive, including for locally affected communities, and reduce the chances the negative impacts. And so I think great progress has been made there. And I'd like to think I played a small role in that. Again, mostly focused on the softer side of things. As an example, leading a team that was looking at the social impact of individual projects as they were being designed, pointing out ways that those projects could be strengthened before they were approved and implemented, to not only address issues like consultation, but make sure that we're giving attention to how poverty would be addressed in these projects, and potential implications for labor, for job loss, and the like.
Okay, and you said something before about futures and foresight in Asia in general, and in some countries like Singapore, for instance. But what's your vision of the future for Asia in general? Like, let's say for year 2050, how's gonna be Asia in 2050 in general? And from a geopolitical point of view, what's your opinion of Asia in general for this year, 2050?
Well, a lot of the discussion focuses on China. China being the big player in terms of economic, political, military, technological weight. That's a big part of Asia. But in all of this focus on China, it's often forgot just how much other parts of Asia remain and will continue to be influential. I cite the example of Southeast Asia. So the countries of ASEAN, right? 10 countries in Southeast Asia: Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and Indonesia, Philippines. You add up all those countries and look at it from an economic standpoint, this will soon be the fourth largest economy in the world. You have an ASEAN economic community that's forming, and They've made it easier to cross borders for citizens in those different countries to cross borders, and for professionals to work in neighboring countries. Low budget airlines and rising household incomes have made it possible to visit and do tourism in neighboring countries. So, and very influential businesses. You have startups in Indonesia, for example, that now they are worth billions and billions of dollars. So I guess one response then to your good and intriguing question is, obviously China is going to have a great influence on how Asia develops and its position in the world. But I would say also look at the rest of Asia, and one can't overlook, of course, the more economically advanced and influential countries like Japan and Korea, and of course India, which has a similar population of China and will soon surpass China in population, and is at a lower level of economic and social development, but is on the rise with huge challenges before it. So what can we see in the future? Well, this is where we need plausible alternative scenarios. So I don't see one future, and I dare not predict. Obviously, China's relationship with the United States and other countries, including developing countries where you have a lot of Chinese investment, this is going to be critical. How does China interact with? How is it received? How is it treated? You have a conflict in systems, in values between China and many Western countries, and this will play out a little bit in Latin America, which I imagine we'll get to in our conversation. So you'll have extraordinary challenges. So even as Asia's made tremendous progress in terms of it's become wealthier, you've reduced poverty, but you have environmental degradation. Asia will be arguably the most climate affected continent of the world. It's certainly, this is indisputable. It's countries in Asia are more affected by disasters than other regions of the world. If you look at numbers of people affected by whether it be tsunamis and mudslides and storm surges, sea surges, a variety of earthquakes, volcano eruptions. I mean, the list goes on and on. And so disasters remain, some of them in the case of, say, climate change and what it might bring, human influence. These are major challenges. And then the pandemic. I mean, as far as we know, it originated in China, COVID, and you've had other major viruses spreading around internationally, H1N1, avian influenza, SARS. So future pandemics are not out of the question. And something else, just to conclude on this note for the moment, in terms of challenges, Asia has to deal with the aging challenge. Yeah. So many countries, particularly in the eastern side of Asia, some of the wealthier countries like Japan and Korea, aging, Singapore, but China is aging fast. And the particular challenge there is, although China's made enormous gains and lifted many out of poverty, they've had a huge impact on global indicators of poverty and social well-being just because of what it's done for its own population. But now it's getting old before it gets rich. So you think of the social protection systems, the safety nets that have been developed first in Western Europe and in North America, other countries like Australia and New Zealand. These were developed over time as those countries got wealthier. China's not that wealthy yet, but it's aging much quicker than those countries did. So they had time to build in systems and pension systems. And so China has a continuing need to grow. At the same time, it's dealing with environmental challenges, climate change, the risk of disease, environmental, I mentioned, and it's likely to face slowing growth and shrinking labor force. And so by 2050, how will this all play out? Well, it's how well these problems are managed, how technology is used. That's a whole, we could spend hours talking about the good and the bad of artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, machine learning. These can be assets in helping to manage some of these challenges and tackle them, but they can also be used for negative purposes. Government surveillance to restrict citizen liberties, cybercrime. I mean, there are a lot of risks out there, Mauricio, is what I'm getting at. But Asia has enormous potential, educated population, and it's made such great gains. Can it get through the next 30 years, addressing in some ways even greater challenges?
Right, big challenges, but big potential in the whole region of Asia, and that leads me to my next question. Last year, I had the chance to present a little paper at the APFN virtual conference. And the topic of my paper was, how could we in Latin America relate to countries in ASEAN, for instance, because I know they are very important. And sometimes we compete with each other right now. And I was trying to draw some scenarios for the future, which kind of cooperation we could set up with countries, especially in the region of ASEAN. And that leads me to my next question. Latin America, Bart, what's your particular vision of the Latin American region right now and for the future? You talk about Asia. What could you say about Latin America now?
When we talk about Latin America of the future, I think we have to look at the recent past and the current challenges before we get to talking about the future. So even before COVID hit, in the, say, 5 years before COVID, Latin America and the Caribbean was experiencing very poor economic performance. You had dropping share of manufacturing and gross domestic product. You had stagnating or declining investment in research and development. Strides that had been made in fighting poverty kind of stalled. Inequality was increasing. And of course, there are challenges. There were challenges of governance and stability, social strife, civil discord. And then COVID hit. So on top of some difficult years going into COVID, then COVID hit, sending tens of millions of people in the region into extreme poverty, into unemployment. You saw a massive reduction in the region's gross domestic product, somewhere between 7 and 8% decline in GDP last year. So it's been extraordinarily difficult. Of course, many countries are still struggling profoundly. You've had hundreds of thousands of people perish, and the economic consequences, the closing of the borders, and government restrictions have affected countries, for example, that are reliant on tourism. So I think particularly the smaller, island countries and such in the Caribbean, having to shut their borders, a huge economic hit. But across industries, with the shakeup of supply chains, for those countries that might depend on remittances, those were hit as well. So extraordinary challenges, we're going through them now. So looking forward, what do we see? Well, so much depends, Mauricio, on getting the vaccine. Okay. And the success in securing doses and vaccinating people varies tremendously by country, right? And this is not, quote unquote, Latin America's problem. The globe, the world, wealthier countries and those that make the vaccine have an obligation, a moral, ethical obligation to help ensure that Latin America gets vaccinated as soon as possible. So how the future unfolds in the next 5 to 10 years, before we look further on, depends so much on when can people be vaccinated so lives can return to something more normal. Now, what are the opportunities? I think you put your finger on something when you talk about your presentation at the APF and looking at ASEAN. I mean, of course, very different countries, cultures, all that. But Latin America, thinking mostly of South America at this point, these are mostly middle-income countries. And ASEAN, you can excluding Singapore and Brunei, which is oil-rich, it's mostly middle-income countries, right? And one of the great, if you could call it a success, I mean, it is a success, is the regional integration and cooperation that's taken place in ASEAN. there's been a lot of criticism of that organization, but stepping outside of just talking about ASEAN and how these countries are relating. Remember, they were in some cases at war with each other in the last few decades. That's hopefully off the table forever. And you have growing economic linkages and trade and movement of people, including for tourism. And so there's something very positive there. So you have this sense of community in Southeast Asia, and growing more important from a global perspective. And so, the opportunities ahead, the potential for Latin America, can historical differences and rivalries among different countries and political systems, is this one leaning left, this one leaning right? Can governments overcome some of these barriers, these obstacles, what's holding the region back to engage in greater regional cooperation? We've seen the success in Europe of the EU. And again, harshly criticized by many. At the same time, easily forgotten is what was Europe before it began to unify, before it began to work more closely together. You had one of the most horrific wars we've known in World War II, and within the EU countries, the prospect of war it's not imaginable. So I guess what I'm saying is, regional integration is one way forward. If you have a positive contribution of citizens, of civil society organizations, of playing a role and contributing to governance and to how communities are supported and lift themselves up, there are some bright signs. We can talk about the tough times before COVID and the suffering going on now, but the fact that the U.S. is opening up, this is so important. This is so important to Latin America, given the geography and trade patterns. Mm-hmm. This is good news. This is really good news for Latin America. You also have now leadership in Washington that is showing a keener interest in working with allies and working with other democracies. You see a strong interest, for example, in Central America. Mm-hmm. And if that translates into true partnerships, into resources, into capacity building, into openness, a forward-looking and open U.S., a prospering U.S. That is engaged and cares about the region and shows that in its actions, this can be very helpful. Of course, this geopolitical relationship between China and the U.S. and the China presence in Latin America, we'll see what kind of influence in directions that could go. On the one hand, if China is helping to finance sustainable projects and providing resources that Latin American countries need, great. Mm-hmm. But where that maybe comes with strings that are less attractive, including maybe labor brought from China or expectations that Latin American countries support certain things at the international level and in UN and other fora, that's maybe a little bit of a different story. So China's involvement in South America can be a positive or less positive thing. Certainly it's of concern to policymakers in Washington, but mm-hmm. speaking from looking at Latin America, what are their interests? There's infrastructure to be built, not just the physical, but the social, the safety nets I'm talking about, building up health systems, which have been so incredibly stressed during the pandemic.
Yeah, interesting insights. And the social part of the whole thing, I guess that's one very important challenge for us in this region of the world. So thank you for your insights, Bart. And now we're almost ending this interview, but I want to ask you about your book, Learning from Tomorrow. I read it. I already did. And it's a great book that I recommend you absolutely. Please get it. You should do that. And why did you write it? Why did you write it? And it was very important for you to write about COVID, and you wrote it before COVID, but you did a lot of recommendations about this and some scenarios made up after COVID. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your book, please, Bart?
Thanks, Mercy, for the chance. Let me just show a cover there for those who are tuning into this interview. So learning from tomorrow, using strategic foresight to prepare for the next big disruption. So I was certainly thinking about futures before the pandemic, but it was in fact during COVID that I put pen to paper or got my fingers on the laptop keyboard to start pounding this out. And so, what's the inspiration for this? Part of it was it goes back to being based in Asia for many years and seeing the future unfold in this dynamic part of the world. But more specifically to Foresight, so many people seem to be caught off guard by the pandemic, and we should have been better prepared because Foresight, among other disciplines, showed us it was going to come, that we were going to have, in all likelihood, we're going to have a pandemic. And the pandemic caused organizations to rip up their plans. So any plans that they had written in 2019 for 2020, by the end of March, you were ripping up those plans. And the same thing, 2020 plans for 2021, people didn't know what to write, how to plan, because there was so much uncertainty. And so part of the inspiration for me was, look, there are tools that organizations, whether they be charities or profit-making businesses or government agencies that are supposed to be serving the people, tools that they can use to better plan, to become more resilient, to seize opportunities, and to be prepared for disruptions like a pandemic or other possible disruptions, including the major, the major trends that are already taking place. So what we've seen during COVID times has been an acceleration of certain trends that already were there, like technological developments, the take-up of the internet and e-commerce that exploded in pandemic times. So you had, going into the pandemic, volatility, rapid change, developments in science, technology, and in other spaces, and that seemed to speed up, to be put in a hyperdrive in the last year and a half. And again, I'm thinking, look, there's ways that we can begin to plot out what are alternative scenarios. And once we have those alternative scenarios, how can we invest in preparing for them and monitor weak signals of change that might highlight something that is becoming either a bigger trend or a trend in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to share this with the world. So the book is actually, it's kind of a primer. As you read it, it's an introduction to Foresight. What is it? How has it been used? And providing some examples internationally, not just focused in one country or another, but from around the world. Here is how Foresight and different approaches are being implemented. And the last aspect I'd highlight is I've included in the book many references and links to support, to further knowledge, to training, to insights into how to use Foresight. Because at the last meeting of the government Foresight community, this is something that's organized by the OECD. They organize a meeting of Foresight specialists from OECD member countries. And the last time they met together was in 2019, physically. Mm-hmm. And at that meeting, they pointed out it was that Foresight is not being taken up because there is a lack of knowledge about the importance of Foresight, one, and two, a lack of accessible tools that people can use. They don't know what the tools are, how to use Foresight. This book addresses that in part. It explains the importance of Foresight, and it highlights what are some of the tools and methodologies, and provides links to further access and more in-depth access. That in a nutshell is what it's about, is spreading the good news of Foresight and how accessible it is to organizations of whatever size.
Yeah, and there's one chapter of the book that I found very, very interesting when you speak about the scenarios and some post-COVID scenarios created by some companies like Deloitte, for instance, or some schools like the International Institute for Management Development in Switzerland. And what I found, and we talk about this at the beginning of the interview, is the period of time for the scenarios. I mean, traditionally in Foresight and Futures, you talk about very long term, right? And in this case, when you talk about public policy and these scenarios that you present, the time horizons are very short. I mean, we're speaking about scenarios for 2 years from now or 3 years from now. And that's something that I wanted to ask you, because I am also a public policy specialist, and I always find this situation when I try to set up scenarios for public policy or for government or public administration. It is kind of complicated to to create scenarios for very long terms. And I want you to tell us something about that. What could you say about this, Bart?
Yeah, we've seen almost a compression of time in the way that Foresight is dealt with. And I attribute that to a couple of things. In the case of COVID, we're in the midst of this chaotic event, experience, and we're all wondering what is it going to look like when we get out. So it's, in some ways, it's kind of hard to look 10, 15 years out for some, because they're looking at what's 2020, when can we go back out and go about our daily lives and hug our friends and loved ones and get on with and travel, right? And so there's a desire to know what's coming soon, not in 10 or 15 years. So I think that's one reason why there's a lot of the scenarios and foresight specialists and futurists, a lot of them have been commenting on rather than in a longer term, looking more short to medium term. And so in the book, as you point out, I've shared some scenarios from different perspectives on what in the next handful of years we might be seeing. One is, people want to get out of COVID and what's going to happen next. The other thing is the acceleration of change. Okay, and this might be the more important one. The technological developments. Think about, in terms of science and health, think about the vaccines. We have multiple vaccines that are to varying degrees effective that have been developed in different places and in the space of a year. I mean, historically, this is unprecedented. This hasn't been done, but human ingenuity and building on past practice, huge focus and with resources to do it, the time to do that has shrunk. Imagine maybe the next time there's a pandemic, they'll shrink it even more. But the technological changes, we talked a lot about Asia in this conversation. Coming back to Southeast Asia, there's been an absolute explosion in access to the internet. As people were in lockdown cities, they were kept close to home. Everybody who was not online, who could afford it, was getting online. And then because they couldn't necessarily walk someplace to sit at a cafe or a restaurant, they were ordering in. So you had food delivery services taking off and other e-commerce. So just an explosion in the use of the internet and new modes of buying and selling. And then the technological advancements like, and I would point to, in this case, to things like 5G, the Internet of Things, virtual reality, augmented reality, and quantum computing. These are going to change our world in ways that are hard to fathom in the next 5 to 10 years, unless you've been focusing on the developments in these spheres. So there's going to be such dramatic change in 5 years. Trying to not predict, that's not what Foresight does, but trying to have a vision of possible, plausible futures 10, 15, 20 years out. It's almost too far. The changes we're going to see in 5 or 10 years are going to be more than we've seen maybe in the last 20, 25, 30, who knows?
Right. Well, I really like very much your book. And again, you should all get it. It's very easy to read it and very interesting as you are going by. So thank you for writing it. And just before we finish, Bart, what's your preferred vision of the future for Canada?
Wow. Building on some of the great things about this country. So among the great things relative to some other, let's say, advanced economies and democracies, that it's a land that's open to people. It's a land of immigration, and maintaining that and building on that. It took a hit in COVID times. People couldn't cross borders and immigrants. I think a country that continues to welcome the world, that continues to be engaged in the world. And I think vital, not just for Canada, but for the world, that Canada takes a more assertive approach and commitment to addressing climate change. So if you look at carbon emissions per person in Canada, it's pretty high, okay? And Canada needs to change that. And it's going to be a difficult change. for many parts of the country, including those that are dependent on fossil fuels. But this is a change that has to be made. So a preferred future is a country that is relying more and more on renewables and at a faster pace and setting an example for the rest of the world, while doubling down in areas where Canada has made a positive impact on discussion around human rights and good governance and gender equality. Continue to strive to be the great country that it is in many respects, with many warts and dark spots that can't be overlooked. But taking a global perspective, Canada has been a beacon for many around the world in terms of its engagement and involvement in the world in a very positive, constructive, collaborative, civil way. And I'd like to see the country double down on that as it makes this all-important energy transition and continues to be open to the world as a great mixing of cultures and links to all regions of the world, including Latin America.
That's right. And as a Mexican, I can say that Canada is a wonderful country. We are commercial partners as well. We have a very close relationship that I think should be deepened in the next years. But still, thank you very much, Bart. Is there anything else that you'd like to say? Something that I didn't ask you?
No, one thing I'd like to say, Mauricio, is thank you very much for this opportunity. I really enjoyed our conversation. I hope you found something useful in it, and your listeners as well. And secondly, for those who are watching this program, maybe for the first time, I strongly encourage you to come back and see past episodes that are recorded and available that you've kindly made open to the world, and future ones, because I know you've got some great guests coming. And so I'm honored to be among the impressive group that you'll be involving over time in these interviews. So I, on my part, encourage everyone to listen to your terrific interviews, which have been so insightful.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, Bart. And where can people contact you?
Well, let's just start with Twitter. If you're on Twitter, look for Big Trends Guy, all one word, Big Trends Guy. And there you can reach out, and if you follow me, you're gonna get a dose of what are some of the big trends that are transforming our world today.
Thank you very much. I will write down your social media in here. And thanks again, Bart. It was a great conversation, and I hope we meet very soon.
I look forward to that. Mauricio, take care. Thanks
Looking
again.
forward to. Take care, you too. See you soon, all.